Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., where we're covering the European Union's 6th Annual Common Security and Defense Policy Symposium. And we have with us Dr. Heather Roff, who is a research fellow at the Global Security Initiative at Arizona State University. Did I get that right?
You got it right.
And also a research fellow with Oxford University.
That is true.
Heather, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Vago.
You did an extraordinary survey. One of the things that you study is autonomous warfare, robotics, artificial intelligence, how that's going to play into warfare. You've been following very closely years of talks in Geneva to sort of set boundaries and guidelines for this as nations, to one degree or another, try to operationalize this capability. And you recently did a survey. Talk to us about the sort of major takeaways from this survey about how populations feel in the United States, overseas, including in China and India, who are sort of, really buck the sort of the trend on some of this.
Yeah, so the survey had about 30 countries, global survey conducted by Ipsos, and it basically asked respondents to rank whether or not they supported or opposed the use of autonomous weapons in war. And I should say that autonomous weapons are weapons that don't have a human operator. They select and engage without human intervention. And that's mostly the DoD's version of events. We have some discussions about definitions happening in Geneva right now, but I'll just go with the DoD's for right now. That survey, the trends pretty much held, I would say, worldwide. Actually, you saw almost identically the breakouts between, the people who were uncertain about it was all sat about 15 to 20%, somewhere in there. Those who supported it were only two. We had two outliers out of the bunch, and that was China and India, where they overwhelmingly supported the use of autonomous systems in war. Whereas everybody else, it was pretty much around 40% saying they oppose it, and 20% saying in the 20s saying that they support. So you had a pretty drastic between 20% to mid 40s saying that they that split, and then India and China just bucking the trend.
And when you say and it was strongly opposed or somewhat opposed, right? Whereas the support was a very low number, as opposed to the somewhat and very were much smaller when it came to India and China.
Yes.
What do you attribute sort of the Western view of this, the European and the American view of it, and why there's the strong opposition to it? And what explains China and India's view of being so supportive towards such systems?
Yeah, I think in the Western world, we have a couple different things. I think we have a little bit of a sci-fi narrative around, killer robots and Terminators and things like that. And so that sci-fi narrative gets taken up a bit. So people go, no, God, I don't want that to happen, right? That would be terrible. And this kind of dystopic narrative with science and technology. But I also think that we have a different version of we want people in control and accountable, and human individual rights, at the front and center. Particularly in Europe, we have, the social and cultural rights are taken, I think, even more seriously than even in the United States, particularly rights to privacy and rights against surveillance and things like that. So I think those kind of explain the backing away of support for those kinds of technologies. In China, I would say they're marching ahead full speed with quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and robotics. And so I think that their entire population is just more accepting of that, mostly because the government is funneling money into it, as well as funneling change and policy all the way down to state level and local level. And so that would explain China. India is a little bit more hard for me to kind of parse out. Some of the discussions with the Ipsos folks, we didn't know if there was maybe a bias in the sampling or an overrepresentation of one group or another.
Because you mentioned, for example, that men with military experience may have been overrepresented in that case. Because the odd thing is, it's the world's largest democracy, so why would it be behaving this way?
Exactly. But we also see that it leans towards hard military stances as well. So it is a democracy, and it is the largest, but it doesn't comport with a wide variety of other types of cultural issues that we talk about when we talk about democracies, particularly its tensions with Pakistan. So I can imagine the rivalry aspect, the tech aspect, and then maybe a sampling bias.
Let's go to where do you think the line lies. Because, for example, when we, and full disclosure for everybody who's watching this, we were just on a great panel discussion. Margaret Brennan of CBS News was a moderator of the discussion. Philip Crowther from France 24 was on, and Jacob Prousher was from Pew Research was also joining us, and we were talking about security polling in the United States and in Europe. And Heather had a portion in that discussion talking about robotics, automation, AI, and autonomous weapons. In your estimation, when you're looking at this field, what's the United States has fielded autonomous systems or systems that to a degree have automatic targeting capabilities, but historically has maintained control over the shot is always taken by a human, largely. Where do you see the lines on this fast evolving space where you have potential adversaries who may not look at any applicable boundary in terms of what they're doing? There's some systems that have been fielded that we hear about here and there. You said most of them are classified, that are sort of autonomous shoot, which has our guys looking at some of this and saying like, wow, okay, that's kind of a different ball game. What are the acceptable boundaries? What do rules of this look like? Because throughout the history of warfare, setting up rules for stuff like this has been very, very hard. We have chemical weapons, no W&D rules, and folks are still using it. So what are the rules and the boundaries?
I think because the discussions in Geneva are taking quite a bit of time, and I'm not confident that they're going to really go very far in establishing those types of rules. And so I think where we need to start looking is at rules of engagement and basically how we're going to create concepts of operational ConOps, right? Concepts of operations, on how we're going to use this, right? And then what do those rules of engagement look like? So if I have a technology over here and I have another one over here and I'm going to put them together, what happens, right? And that, I think, is where we can start developing norms. So not only norms of use, but norms of what I don't use them for, right? So then if you say, look, I need autonomous capabilities in space, I need them in the ocean, and I need them for suppression of enemy air defenses. That's all I need them for, right? Okay, well then all of a sudden that becomes kind of a norm of use, particularly if the US is doing it or it gets taken up by NATO or like-minded states or things like that. Then I think you can kind of see cultural practices shifting in that way when you can get kind of soft law, when you don't have to really worry about, an additional protocol on the Geneva Conventions or anything like that, which are a heavier lift, right? Because what you really want is militaries to ingrain it and do it voluntarily, because that has way more impact than saying no chemical and biological weapons, because if you want to use them, you're going to get them, you're going to use them. So incentivizing the kinds of behaviors that we want to see, where they're, bounded operations in space, right? What kinds of targets are they allowed to prosecute? How long are they allowed to be deployed? How many times do they have to check in? What does a check-in look like? What does a human-operator relationship look like, right? How much does a human have to be present or supervising? Those are the types of questions I think that we need to be really, really pressing upon now at that training and doctrine level, and then kind of bottom up and looking at these alternative forms of governance for these systems.
What happens, though, if one of our adversaries, for example, Britain was, the United States invented the submarine, the modern submarine. Britain was right up there as being one of the first people to investigate, to play with it, to figure out what sort of applications there are, and it was deemed to be somewhat an underhanded weapon. Right. And as a consequence, the world's largest navy at the time said, you know what, this isn't our cup of tea. The rising power in challenging them in 2 world wars used very effectively submarines in undeclared submarine operations that became quite deadly and actually almost tipped the balance of the conflict in two major wars. What happens in a universe where we are abiding to a certain set of rule sets and a potential adversary is actually completely disregarding it?
Well, I think it's the same thing that Churchill faced in the Second World War, right? Do we want to abandon our values to win, or do we want to uphold our values and fight like hell, right? And what I would suggest is that we use our strength of our values, right? Because we're democracies, because we have a plurality of ideas, we have great technology coming out of at least this country and other democracies. Use the technology to figure out technological defenses against, an adversary that's not going to be very nice to play with. Use that to our advantage, right? But don't abandon the values, right? Once you abandon the values, well then, all bets are off the table, and we get into total war types of discussions. And that I just think is, it's not only un-American, right? I think it's just, it would be destructive of the entire world, right? I mean, we'd be staring down into an abyss that I don't think we'd really want to get out of.
You have talked about, and you talked about the connection between sort of autonomous military systems and how quickly they get adopted by policing, bomb robots. You mentioned the case in Dallas where a shooter situation was resolved. It's seen as sort of a seminal moment where a bomb disposal robot took a bomb in to kill what was an active shooter, unfortunate situation, and it killed the perpetrator. But in policing, there's an intimate relationship with science, and predictive policing has been something that's been going on for decades. But the artificial intelligence revolution has driven that quantum leaps forward. New York City has benefited from it. Other state and local municipalities that face budget problems are looking towards this kind of to maximize their police bang for their buck. What are some boundaries and things that citizens, that everybody needs to think about as this technology is increasingly adopted by law enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to tread really carefully on adopting artificial intelligence when it comes to anything related to rights, right? So rights against, imprisonment, prosecution, due process, things like this, right? So we need fair and accountable and transparent algorithms, right? We want to, and the problem that we face right now is a lot of these algorithms and these packages that police departments are adopting are proprietary. So they're not going to tell them, well, what data did you use to train it to do this? Let me see the algorithm. I want to interrogate it. These are questions that need to start being posed and answered. And right now they're just starting to be posed in the governance areas. So I think some of these lines, we really need to say, if you're going to adopt it, I want to see the training data. Right? I want to see it, I want to field it, I want to beta test it over here before I actually use it in these other areas, because we don't want to beta test bad algorithms on our civilian population.
Which you've said can often be race biased in terms of the...
Race biased, gender biased, socioeconomics play into it, right? Because we have to think about all of the ways in which the data that's used in these systems, yes, they find patterns. Algorithms find patterns in large sets of data, but who's deciding what gets into that set to then find those patterns? Right?
Because you said all of us are breaking the law,
yeah.
So having some sort of system that's looking at us and figuring out.
Right.
Right.
I mean, in fact, I saw a great paper the other day, and it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek paper, but it was a predictive policing paper on when and where to spot white-collar crime.
Everywhere?
Exactly. But it was like he predict, within this zone, these blocks, and this is what they're going to look like with facial recognition. It was all, old white guys. But it was a tongue-in-cheek paper, but it was like, look, predictive policing cuts both ways, right? So you have to really look at, what is it that you're trying to identify? Right. Where is the data that you're drawing, that you're downloading this from? Who's training the algorithm? And we need to be able, and citizens have to have a right to say, hey, wait a minute, how did I get on this list, right? Why is it that I'm subject to these types of things rather than, Bobby Joe and
right.
in 85018, right?
I don't know what that means, but I'm sure it's an interesting zip code. And I was going to say about your earlier comment, I'm beginning to resemble that remark. When you are looking at, it's also funny, by the way, trading is increasingly being automated.
Yeah.
So actually from a predictive financial crime standpoint, it's going to be very, very interesting to see whether or not individuals would be prosecuted in that case.
Yeah.
But, how do you do that if the firm's predictive algorithm is the one that's slightly skewed to skim for the firm or something, right?
Yeah. And then you're looking at more of like the corporate responsibility stuff, yeah. Which, corporations can be held legally responsible. So we'll go after the board members and do all these other things. But yeah, I mean, AIs they're going to be populating our universe at such an exponential rate, right? I mean, we're going to be seeing the use of artificial intelligence everywhere, in our homes, in our medicine, in our offices, in our cars.
Well, they're already there, right?
Yeah, they are already there, but they're going to, it's just starting to kind of blossom and reach out.
So how long, you've been spending years studying this, but from the military standpoint, the societal standpoint, and full disclosure, you're not saying don't use these systems.
No.
You're saying think through.
Yeah.
So what is the window we have as society to get our arms around these questions?
Right now, this is the time right now. Last summer, in the Obama administration, we had a series of meetings with the Office of Technology, and the White House created a paper on the social and economic implications of AI for Americans, right? And that was a really good move to start thinking through what are the policy implications, like where are all of our blind spots? And we need to continue that kind of momentum in trying to get our arms around it, talking to experts in machine learning, talking to humanists, talking to science and technology people, talking to roboticists, talking to philosophers, having a multiple stakeholder, multidisciplinary discussion that even includes, people, the man on the street, that I can say, hey, this is what this application is doing for you. Do you understand it? Let's work through it, right? Because it's not scary, it's not magic. It's just math, but it really, I think we need to have that kind of, that discussion of breaking down some of the myths, the myth busting about it, but also creating an upswell of understanding so that we can see where our blind spots are and get our hands around the problem.
Isn't one of the big challenges that as you move to this sort of automated future, computer-aided manufacturing, additive manufacturing is going to change them?
Yep.
I mean, isn't the entire microfoundries,
right,
local motors.
Right.
We will print and build a car for you on demand with a handful of people. How does that change what is already a very unstable global most of what we're seeing is economic inequity that's playing out all around the world, whether it's the riots and the demonstrations you're seeing in China, where the government is struggling to be able to produce the kind of growth that people have come to expect.
Yep.
In part because the economic factors aren't there, poor investment decisions, a little bit too much in real estate. You saw it in Brexit, which was a backlash. You saw it in the Netherlands. That ended up on the right way, but you've seen it in France. You're seeing it now manifest in the British elections. You certainly saw it in the election of Donald Trump. You saw Austria, right? A few of these did fall on the right side of things. But almost everybody is, or not necessarily everywhere in Europe, but Europe faces that as well. Certainly there is that issue in the United States. And it would seem that in the next 5 years, all of that gets compounded by self-driving cars, even more advanced domestic automated manufacturing. I mean, the United States produces an enormous lot. It just doesn't need a lot of people to produce that. So how do these are going to change society? And is anybody properly having the debate on how profoundly it's going to change life and how some folks will not have the skills potentially to compete or even survive in this economy?
Yeah, I mean, we did some of that discussion with the White House report, and I'm not happy about how many of the folks in government that came to speak, even from like former President Obama's Economic Advisors Council and things like this, they were taking, I think, an archaic view of what's going to happen. And so I think what you do see is you see major tech leaders having this discussion. So Andrew Ng from Baidu, Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn, Elon Musk from Tesla, right? You see Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook. We have the Googles and everybody else, and DeepMind in particular is very vocal on this. The tech leaders are saying it's coming, and you need to figure out your economics, because otherwise, we have what's called, so Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, two economists from MIT, have this book called The Second Machine Age. And in it, they have this great graph where they track GDP and wages, right, from, probably like the 50s, maybe even before, the 30s, all the way up to today. And what they call it is the great decoupling. So you see GDP do this, go up, and they track, right, until about the 70s, and they start to decouple. And now they're like this. So real wages have remained flat while GDP goes up, and that's because of automation. That's because we can depress wages. We don't have to have robots take our jobs, but we can depress wages by the threat of automation. So I don't have to pay you more because I might be able to get a robot to do what you do. But we definitely do see some robotic replacements in different skills, in different areas, particularly agriculture. So I think what we really need to do is we need to start having serious discussions about universal basic income. Not that it's the devil handout of communism and socialism and all this stuff, but a real, truly unique discussion about upskilling, reskilling, and re-education programs for people who are in their 20s all the way to people who are in their 40s that are going to have this, like, I'm not retired yet. I got maybe another 10 or 15 years left on my work life. What are we going to do about it? And so then how do we start raising income for a UBI? How do we, do we tax the robots? Do we tax the companies, right? We need to have serious conversations about raising that capital, as well as doing the necessary education retooling for our youngest people, our youngest little people, as well as the people that are going to be most immediately affected, that are people who don't want to go back to school, maybe have families and work commitments and everything else. And so we have to think novelly about ways of incentivizing them to go back to school. Childcare, right? Bus fare. What is it that we need to be able to get those people the skills that they require to succeed in this world?
Heather, thanks so much. Could talk to you all day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well. Thanks, Vago.